and welcome to the Scuttlebutt Podcast, the show for current and former service members looking to make better decisions, think deeper, and earn more money. My name is Brock Briggs, and each week I do that by bringing you a conversation with a badass veteran at the top of their craft. Today I'm speaking with Doug Pugliese. Doug is a former naval aviator and translator, as well as the former managing director at Bear Stearns, where he rode through the dot-com bubble and the GFC. Today he is head of 1042 QRP strategies at Alpha Architect. In this conversation, you're going to hear a bit of it all. We start with a bit about Doug's time in the Navy. I mentioned to you he was a translator. Early in life, he learned Spanish, which landed him as a translator for an admiral and the president of Paraguay in the late 80s. He gives a bit of a history lesson about the U.S.'s involvement in South America during that time and shares some photos of him with some very notable figures, including the general who staged a coup and overthrew that president. We also hear what Doug learned about risk in financial markets, working through a few of the most notable time periods in financial history. And we also learn about ESOPs, or employee stock ownership programs, what they are, why they're important, and what Alpha Architect is doing in this world today. If you haven't already, a good primer for this conversation is last week's episode with Wes Gray, the CEO of Alpha Architect. We talk about several things discussed in this conversation and would be a great listen to as a primer for it. Don't forget, you can always check out the episode, transcripts, the YouTube channel, and newsletter where I dive deeper on each episode every week, all at scuttlebuttpodcast.co. Enjoy this conversation with Doug Pugliese. One of the best places to start with these is find out what you are the most proud of.
Well, that's a good question because I guess up until about a year or two ago, I would have probably fed you some stuff about having successfully landed an aircraft on a pitching deck at night after an engine failure. You know, everyone walking away with their lives, which I was, I think, rightfully proud of, or at least not having carried around a bad story from that incident. But I think I've grown older, my perspective has changed, and I think the real interesting thing for me about life is that as your perspective changes, certain things kind of come into clearer focus. I am most proud of my three kids who are now all teenagers. They're growing up beautifully. They seem to have life by the short hairs. They're principled, they're hardworking, they're independent, and my wife has just done a great job raising them. They kind of combine the right balance of excelling academically and athletics. One's captain of sports team, the other one is working on her third letter of the school year. They're just wonderful kids, and I think that I probably would be remiss if I didn't cite them as the thing that I'm most proud of.
How much of that do you think is driven by like the change in individual accomplishments and like the value that we put on those in terms of like us setting out to kind of achieve this grand set of obstacles and overcoming and whatever, to seeing that you have the ability to pass that on to others? This is a conversation that is highly personal. Obviously, I got a baby on the way, and there's been all these questions about legacy and what does that mean, and it kind of has me thinking a lot about this.
Well, I kind of live by the Socrates law, to do no harm, really, first and foremost. And the thing that I've observed as a parent is that it's really easy to screw your kids up. We all kind of pay it forward, right? Whatever we got growing up is kind of the model that we use going forward. And I don't think enough people tell you that. I don't think enough people say to you, think about how you grew up and whether or not there were things that you didn't enjoy that you're now perhaps meeting out on your own kids. So when I think of legacy, I think of just trying to build good people and instilling in them values and really the ability to be independent and hoping that there's enough raw material. I'm talking about my kids, obviously, but I think we can all think about legacy as the eternality of it's hard to live forever, right? The way we live forever is through our kids. And I think that's the greatest legacy that we leave. If we're lucky enough to leave a legacy in some other way outside of that, then we're truly indeed fortunate. But really, I think in my case, just trying to grow healthy, balanced kids. And thank goodness, two people usually undertake that. My wife is far more balanced than I am in that regard and has done a much better job instilling those values. So for me, that's what legacy means. As I get older, of course, I'll probably seek to compound that legacy with things that might be of broader help to the rest of the world. But right now, my focus is really on creating smart, balanced, principled kids.
I think that that's an admirable goal, and I hear it from people on this show much more frequently than I think I thought I would. And that's encouraging to me. I think that, as you said, you can't live forever, but the closest way that you can do that is by teaching and embodying the skills and values and all those things that you think are the most important in somebody that will continue to live.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's interesting. Would you mind sharing the story that you alluded to at the beginning? I'd be remiss if I didn't ask. The landing on the pitch deck.
Oh, aviation's a fraught profession. I was fortunate to be able to pursue naval aviation out of college in the Navy, and I just eventually, when you get into flight hours, you encounter enough situations where the risks kind of shift out of your favor, and so you have to always stay vigilant. And one evening, we had a night we were working off the coast of South America in non-combatant friendly operations, but working out at sea, regardless, is always a fraught endeavor. And sun had fallen, and we were, as we say, heavy, five people on board and lots of fuel. And when we picked up into a hover, the ship typically points into the wind to get ready for aircraft departures like that. And so whoever is going to be favored by the wind usually will be the person flying, meaning that if the ship turns one way and the aircraft has wind coming across the deck the other way, the pilot who's going to be taking off is determined by whoever is going to be closest to the ship's superstructure, because there's a lot of things that the aircraft can obviously hit. And we're working on small ships like frigates and destroyers. And so that evening, it turned out that one of the components in our aircraft, a fuel injection unit, had been gun decked. We learned this after the fact. And instead of a gasket in that unit, there was some kind of a caulking glue. Who the hell knows what it was? Could have been Bondo. Who knows what was used instead? But those are the kinds of things that cause accidents. And as we're picking up into the hover, my role was to be on the gauges and paying attention to the caution lights and all the sounds, while the other pilot in the other seat was actually tasked with flying off. And it's funny how training kicks in, but I heard it and saw it at the same time. The gauge went to zero. The torque gauge went to zero on our rotor system on the right engine, the number 2 engine. I heard a sound like that, which is the sound you'd anticipate hearing when a turbine spools down under load. And, just as soon as these things are happening in real time, you're saying things like number 2 engine failure, set it down. And that is really the point in time when the aircraft starts losing controllability. And at that point, we were sliding off the deck. So the pilot had just enough time to level the wings and set it down before we flopped into the drink. I don't think it was anything particularly interesting, other than the fact that we were 3 feet closer to a spot than we could have been. If we had been 3 feet perhaps away from the spot, we would have had a swim that night, and probably just as well, since I was on the side that would have gone into the water first. And anyway, just it's great to have those experiences and to be able to put the right happy ending on it. But that's one of a number of things that happen to you over the course of a career, and that was what I alluded to.
It seems interesting. I like your point that you made initially about how you're in such a dangerous profession, and it's only as you increase, you're increasing in skill and ability, but you're also continuing to take chances. And there is a finite amount of times that can happen. I can't even imagine how scary that would be. Like you said, even only 3 feet, but being in an object that is moving, that is that big and heavy, being moved 3 feet is quite scary with you being in it, and it's not moving of your will. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's a great experience to be in those situations. There's a lot to the fact that people say, I really feel alive when I'm in those moments. It's certainly a profession where you have lots of opportunity to feel alive. But I think the risks of the profession came home to me one day when I was, I don't mean to go off on a tangent, but I was presenting some procedure in our squadron's regular monthly safety stand down, which is a time when pilots get around in the wardroom and train. And I kind of casually asked the question among the wardroom officers there, my fellow pilots in the squadron, how many of you have been in the drink? How many of you have gone into the water? And it was a room of about 18 people that day, and all but 3 hands went up, which I was stunned to see. I was stunned to see that virtually everybody in that room had had an opportunity to land, mostly controlled, it seemed, but to land in the drink in the ocean, which is just kind of a terrifying thought when you think of what happens when a ship lands. First of all, it turns upside down and it starts to sink. And if you're trying to get out of an aircraft and you've got straps and harnesses and things on and you're getting caught up in flight controls, that's a pretty scary situation to be in. So I was gratified that everyone had gotten out. Obviously, there's a survivorship bias there. You don't see the people who didn't get out. And there were a number of those in, spirits in the room. But it's really kind of a remarkable, eye-opening experience when you get that kind of information.
Post a story or experience like that, is there anything that you found yourself doing differently in the day-to-day? I think probably on a high level, you're thinking about your life as a pilot probably a little bit differently, and that sense of mortality and all of that. But is there anything that you found yourself doing differently in kind of on like a smaller scale?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, you have to kind of start off with an understanding that the Navy wants you in that phase in life when you think yourself to be indestructible, at least in that aviation job. And that's probably like 22 years to 28 years of age, right? That's the age where you think it happens to the other guy, it's not going to happen to me. And they just hope that they can beat into your head an understanding of the importance of learning your procedures, learning your emergency procedures cold, and building competence so that you don't take that indestructibility notion to an extreme. So I think that that trade-off is like wakefulness to sleep, right? Or sleep to wakefulness. You're gradually appreciating the risks and learning about them and experiencing them firsthand. And that process is what kind of tempers you as an aviator, hopefully in time to keep you and your crew safe and enable you to accomplish your mission. So that transition, I recall, with the benefit of hindsight, occurring when I was a junior pilot. We would do kind of fun, but probably in retrospect, silly things, not things that violated the law necessarily, but risks that we could have taken perhaps less needlessly. Yet those are the kinds of things you do as you build an understanding of your skills and your aircraft. And I think every parent just has to hope that their kid figures out that they shouldn't do that in time.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the kinds of, that just to answer your question, there's a gradual awareness that occurs. You're not in a toy, you're being paid to be a professional, and yet you still want to understand the envelope of the aircraft and understand what it can do. And those are all kinds of a give and take that aviation careers, let you take.
I was talking with a guy on a recent episode that was a Army Apache pilot, and was just talking about how you're fighting so many things as a pilot. You're fighting physics, you're especially in helicopters, you're doing things that it's kind of not designed to do. That thing doesn't occur naturally in nature, and it really takes some crazy experiences to kind of connect the reality with what you kind of know it to be. It's not You
Great
can
point.
very quickly get yourself in a bad situation, and the outcomes are pretty devastating.
It's true. It's true. The point that I think you just made about that gentleman, it sounds similar, parallel to the point that I was making, which is you have to educate yourself and be educated by your fellow pilots in time to avoid taking those risks too far. You're not there to take those kinds of risks. You're there to take different controlled risks and accomplish a mission. And so that's why it's an interesting balance. But at the same time, people are curious. They want to know what their aircraft and airframes can do. And so there's an element of that goes on as a pilot.
You were so kind to share some old photos, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll be able to appreciate these. If you're not watching on YouTube, you should be. So the link to that is in the show notes. You can check that out. I'm going to tee these up, and maybe you can give us a look-see on, walk us through what we're looking at here. This is a very studly young Doug right here.
Man, yeah, I'm a shadow of my former self. I now fly a desk, as you can see, so it's not nearly I feel like I've fallen a long way, but that was a cross-country flight that I took, and I managed to find the one instructor at Pensacola who was from New England. And when I was going through my training phase in Pensacola as a student naval aviator, we have a phase where you have to take a cross-country or two or three. And I volunteered for cross-country, and I linked up with this gentleman who later became a friend, and we went to Martha's Vineyard together. And so that was arriving in Martha's Vineyard. My mother, of course, took that photograph, and this was in the days before digital photography, really. So I don't have too many photos. That's the one that seems to get the most attention. So I thought I'd toss that to you. I apologize if it seems conceited. It's the only good photo I really have.
It's a great one. I love it. Yeah, I was actually talking with my wife last night, and I was just like, oh, I'm really excited for this conversation, and I was showing her the pictures, and she's like, oh, who is this? And I was like, oh, settle down.
Who's that guy?
And then this is another great photo. Where was this taken at?
This is off the coast of Brazil, I think. We were getting ready to fly, and the ship was approaching Rio, and so you can see the sun is rising. And so the aircraft's out on the flight deck, and we've got our gear, and you can see an ATOPS manual and the dash there and knee boards and stuff. And I'm just about to dash inside and throw on a flight suit so I could jump in the aircraft and fly that morning. We did most of our flying at night, just because that's when, we train as we fight. And I think the Navy puts a premium on being adept at flying at night. And so that was kind of a pre-dawn flight that was about to take off probably in about 40 minutes.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I want to kind of get into a little bit of your background and love to kind of tee up. You were at University of Pennsylvania from 83 to 88, if I've got that right, and then kind of rolling into the Navy immediately after that in aviation. You also studied Spanish literature in college. What was the interest there?
Well, so I was fortunate enough to be an exchange student, and really took an interest in Spanish. And I realized that it was my ticket out of a small town, in a sense, from a pretty young age. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, and my father was overbearing, and I always seemed to be, running from his wrath. So I just wanted to leave, and I realized that I could be an exchange student when I was probably a freshman in high school if I mastered Spanish and my grades were decent. And so I applied myself, and it turned out that I had a very strong interest in Spanish. As I learned more, I fell in love with the language. So that experience of learning a language enabled me to travel to Bolivia for a year. I was 15 when I left. I went 4,000 miles away. I got as far away as I could. And it was one of the most formative years of my life. I got to do a lot of wonderful, fun things. And I guess it was that interest in that experience and the interests that I was able to cultivate down there that I found myself wanting to pursue in college. I think that experience also enabled me to get into college. I went to University of Pennsylvania, and I put together what I thought was a curriculum that enabled me to indulge that interest. So I really wanted to understand the culture and the economics of the place where I lived. It was a crazy experience, inflation of 1,000%. So I put together a double major of Spanish literature, that's what it says on paper, and economics. But what I really wanted to do was meld my interest in Latin American culture, history, literature, language, and so forth. And so that's why I studied that.
I'm guessing it had to do with that background that set you up as a translator in the Navy.
Yes. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good.
When I got to college, my old man told me there was no money to pay for it, and so I should probably go and find a scholarship somewhere. So after my freshman year, I applied for an ROTC scholarship and was fortunate enough. In those days, Ronald Reagan was building a 600 ship Navy, so I got a scholarship. And as I am in these early classes of what was called naval science, I encountered a professor named Greg Saul, who flew an aircraft that he said was a model that, even though it was an older model, people who flew those aircraft got to typically travel around this annual South American exercise. And I thought to myself, that sounds like right up my alley. So based on that, I was fortunate to become an aviator and then select that aircraft so that I could take that round the continent trip. It's such a crazy, harebrained scheme, but it actually came true. And it was on that trip where I was flying with the various navies of South America, and we were doing, joint exercises together and learning interoperability. It was on that trip that I found myself frequently attending the same cocktail parties in the evenings that this admiral who ran the whole exercise and ran South America for the US, I encountered him frequently at those parties, and he pulled me aside one day and said, what the hell are you doing? Why am I always seeing you at these parties, socializing with the very people that I'm trying to get to know here? And I just, I guess I was a bit of a bon vivant, and I probably told him so. And he said, well, I want you to come work for me. And that's really how it happened. It was just a very fortunate encounter that enabled me to make that transition.
It's interesting how seemingly fate, or kind of a combination of your unique skills and the right opportunity, what that can lead to if you're just even if you're not even searching for it. It's a kind of luck, but a prepared luck almost.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, if you were to have the misfortune of reading my high school yearbook, which I don't recommend to anybody because we went to school in central Pennsylvania, and there were a lot of kids who lived on farms, or anyway, I don't mean to suggest anything by that, but it was a fairly bland high school class. But in that yearbook, my objective, my goal was to become an ambassador to Bolivia, the ambassador to Bolivia. I think I'd had a chance to meet him over Christmas when I was down there, and he said to me, look, the military is a great stepping stone. I was a naval officer, and so being in the military was a really great way for me to become a foreign service officer. So, that stuck in the back of my mind. And when I found myself in the Reserve Officer Training Corps as a naval officer candidate, I wondered whether that was just a possibility. And funny enough, it went full circle. When I worked for this admiral who ran South America, funny enough, we actually went to Bolivia, and I found myself right back in that ambassador's residence with a drink in my hand, talking to 20 years later. 10 years later, I was 15 when I was down there, and I was probably 23 when I went back as a naval officer. So if you can imagine the things that had to kind of come together, the quirks of fate that had to align for me to be able to have that experience and enjoy that kind of round trip, it's kind of mind-boggling, but it was wonderful, good fortune.
Mind-boggling is a light word for that. That is so strange and interesting, though.
Yeah.
What do you think that you learned from that experience about preparedness versus luck versus chasing your interests?
Yeah,
I think that there's so many interesting things that people can be into. And I don't know, I didn't grow up with any people, nor had the interest in becoming the ambassador of Bolivia myself. And that's incredibly unique. But I think that
it
there's
was
something
tongue
to
in
be
cheek.
said there.
I didn't have any realistic expectation that I would, but
You
I'm
could
sorry.
have been. You
I could
were
have been.
right on the path.
I
And
was.
who knows, it might be coming.
I'm too old for the foreign service now, sadly. So what did I learn? Well, when you go to a foreign, and I mean a really foreign place like South America, Bolivia is, it's the number 2 poorest country in Latin America. You are shocked into an immersive, if you're fortunate, shocked into an immersive experience where you really learn an awful lot. One of the things I learned was that life is perhaps not valued systemically or institutionally in the same way we value life in the U.S. Just to kind of put a point on that, there were guys standing around with machine guns on every corner, and I remember one day I was trying to buy strings for my guitar, and I went to a music store which was inside a building, and I went to the 3rd floor and bought guitar strings and came out into the hallway. I was going to go downstairs to the street, and I noticed there was an elevator. So I thought, oh, maybe I'll take the elevator. But it was an elevator of kind of an older variety where the elevator moves inside the shaft, and there is just a door preventing you from walking into the shaft when the elevator's not there. No cage. And I went over to this door, which had a window, but the window was missing. It must have broken. And I remember putting my hands on the windowsill and, looking down this dark elevator shaft, wondering where the elevator was because I had pressed the button and couldn't see anything. And I kind of felt a little cold breeze on the back of my neck. And, it was one of those things. Instinctively, I pulled my head away just in time for the elevator to go by my nose. And I realized my head would have probably been lobbed off had I stuck it in there much longer. And so, that's the kind of thing that, broken empty windowsill in a door for an elevator shaft is the kind of thing that would not have happened in the US because we have rules and laws in place to protect people from that. But it's the kind of thing that in South America can happen very easily. And I remember going out to the street and throwing up, realizing that I had come pretty close to, having my head at the bottom of that elevator shaft. That kind of thing I encountered really everywhere, from road safety to, military demonstrations against the military leadership at the time, and economic demonstrations by working people who were suffering from inflation. Those are the kinds of experiences where you realize we do a better job of safeguarding human life up here than they do down there. That was an important experience and an eye-opening one.
It's very easy to get complacent about how good we have it here. You don't have to go very far in any direction to see that it's, we have plenty of opportunities here to improve, but we also have a lot farther to fall as well, should things go in the other direction. I'm going to share my screen again. I want to look through some of these other pictures you shared and hear some of the backstory on these.
Oh, great. Well, we're in Paraguay here. The gentleman on the left is the admiral that I worked for, the second admiral that I worked for. I worked for 2 admirals in succession down there as aide and translator. And we were in Paraguay in 1993, meeting with the new president of Paraguay, a guy named Carlos Wasmosi, and he was the first democratically elected leader in that country in 30 plus years. You may recall that Paraguay suffered under a military dictatorship from a strongman named General Stroessner. And Stroessner eventually was thrown out of office and moved to exile, and elections were held, and this gentleman, Carlos Wasmosi, was elected. And we had a very pleasant interview with him. And one of the things we're trying to do in these encounters with government officials is, get an understanding of their mindset, what's going on in the country, what they're concerned about. The gentleman who took that photograph might have been, he was in the room, so I don't know if he took the photograph or not. It might have been the general counsel for the embassy down there. But what we're doing is trying to inculcate democratic values. And in that conversation, President Wasmosy said to us, I've got a lot on my plate here. It's very difficult steering a country toward democracy when we're so used to dictatorship. And in fact, there's one or more generals in the ranks that I think are, keen to see me gone. So it was just a very interesting conversation with leader of a small South American landlocked country. And it kind of set up a very interesting visit to Paraguay for us, because we then met with other leaders in the country on the military side who indeed expressed their distrust of this president and all that he stood for, and unsure about the path that the country was on and so forth.
With you in that position, are you kind of taking to be that we are there to put in and support these democratic leaders? Was that kind of the mission? I know a little bit about our involvement in Panama and the area down during that time, but would love maybe just kind of your knowledge or an overview about the setup of the situation going into that kind of turbulent time.
Yeah, I was a pretty naive and idealistic person, unaware in that instance, right? I'm translating for the two of them, unaware of the kind of machinations that had been going on probably since time immemorial by the CIA and other organizations in the U.S. to steer the politics of the continent. There's a great book called Legacy of Ashes that I encourage everybody to read, because it really is kind of a laundry list of our failures, not just in Latin America, but around the world. But that said, I know we were in our mission there to support democratically elected governments and to encourage good behavior and the U.S. style values. And that's the mission that I felt, in my heart, day to day, working in this role here with this admiral, and nothing that I saw suggested otherwise. The admiral on many occasions told me, look, we don't want to teach these guys how to storm the government palace. We want to teach these guys how to be an apolitical military and strengthen the institutions of the continent, and to work with us to be better allies. So that was really, our mission. Frankly, I apologize if I didn't answer your question properly, but I think that was close enough.
No, that's perfect. This is another picture of you that you shared. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, this was dinner. I think it was that same evening, and I'm kind of caught with my mouth open, looking off in the distance. But I'm actually, again, conversing with the gentleman to my right. So I'm in a white shirt there, and to my right in drab olive green is a general from the Paraguayan military. His name is Lino Oviedo. And beside us are various members of the embassy staff and defense attaché. But across the table from General Oviedo is, again, the admiral in plain clothes. We're having dinner. And that general is, of course, I shouldn't say of course, interestingly enough, expressing the views that I mentioned before, that, maybe this democratically elected president is off on the wrong foot and, needs to be watched carefully. Again, distrustful of what was viewed as the wrong path. And you hear these political views in a lot of places, but in a country like Paraguay, when someone in power says, I'm distrustful of the path the government's going on, there's always the possibility that they might do something about it, take matters into their own hands. In fact, that's what General Oviedo did. He has a really interesting biography, and he's deceased now, died in a helicopter crash, but not before staging a coup, not too long after we left, staging a coup and deposing President Wasmosy. And it's a really fascinating story. This happened probably 18 months after we were there. He deposed Carlos Wasmosy, declared himself, the supreme leader, and engaged in all kinds of quirky authoritarian activities. It was interesting that, I don't think I'm sharing anything or speaking out of school that I shouldn't. He was ultimately apprehended when he visited the general counsel's office at the U.S. Embassy, and perhaps lured there by the possibility that he was gaining stature in the eyes of the U.S., but ultimately apprehended and thrown in jail for that coup in the office of the general counsel, the consul general, excuse me. I keep calling him the general counsel. He's not a lawyer. He's a diplomat. Paraguay doesn't rate on ambassadors, so we have a consul general down there. And so it was a really interesting example of how these tensions are working their way through these countries as they try or seek to transition, perhaps not successfully, to less authoritarian, more democratic governance.
Here's one other with him again, I believe.
Yes, sir. Here's the entire cast of characters. So Paraguayan Navy, which is a funny statement. You can see the officers of the Paraguayan Navy are wearing black. The Paraguayan Navy consists of a riverine force. When I say riverine, I mean they've got a border with Brazil, perhaps one of the world's key smuggling junctures. And so that Paraguayan Navy is tasked with controlling drug interdiction and containing smuggling. I'm not sure that it did a very good job of that, at least at the time. But you see to my left, in other words, to my right in this image, the gentleman in the suit is the consul general of the embassy. Two over from him is the admiral, and beside the admiral is President Wasmosy. And funny enough, second from the right at the end is General Lino Oviedo. All of us posing here for our group photograph during a day of meetings and conversations.
Did you feel weird after the fact, like when this coup goes down after the fact, where you just like, I was just there, like we were literally talking to these people trying to make sure that this didn't happen? Like that had to be such a weird feeling.
Yeah, I had that experience again and again and again. It's just a remarkable thing. I mean, the virtues of a career in the military, if you can make it work, are that you can encounter really interesting people in your work. And when I found this article in the paper, I was still working for this admiral. This is 1994. When I found this article about General Oviedo, I clipped it out and saved it, because I just thought, wow, that times are, we live in interesting times. And I just thought this was a really remarkable experience. And again, as I say, this kind of happened in every country in one form or another. Seeing these characters, these were the real life people moving things in these countries. And so invariably you come into contact with people who are actors, not the good kind of actors sometimes.
I think that this really serves to highlight the difficulty of military service when you are maybe not directly connected with the outcome of things. You're kind of filling a role of performing some action, but the outcome, like you're a very, very small piece. And even going up the ranks, like you're just a little bit bigger. You're just not as small. And
it's insane. What you're talking about is insane when you step back and realize you are the smallest cog in a very big machine. And even as a senior officer, even as a captain, you're still 4 or 5 ranks down from the very highest of the military leadership. And that's after an entire 30-year career. You might be a captain. When I say captain in the Navy, that's an 06. It's amazing how big these organizations are, as you suggest, and how small players we really are And that's under, that's of course an organization that in turn is under civilian leadership. So a long way from the top. But the Navy gives you great experience and great responsibility, and it's a wonderful place to get your hands dirty, as I like to think. By the way, that article about Lino Oviedo mentions an interesting fact, and that is that Lino Oviedo was responsible for deposing the dictator, General Stroessner. And he did so by walking into his office with a hand grenade saying, "I'm going to blow this up if you don't get the hell out of here." So it's a crazy, anyway. And what happened to Oviedo? He himself, while campaigning for president after spending time in jail for his coup attempt, he himself probably was the victim of, I would probably say, skullduggery when his aircraft crashed and he died. So but we're just like you say, we're just small cogs in a big machine interacting with these important and powerful forces.
You don't have to dig too deep into like the countries that we've mentioned here, or even ancient civilizations, about how this struggle for power kind of eventually corrupts. It's either you're going to rule by force and kind of like enslave people, or hope for kind of a democratic thing. But there's always this threat of somebody who's more powerful coming in, and taking a grenade to the office is, I guess, one way to ensure that things change hands right away. But back to kind of what we were saying before about being grateful to live in a place where we have some semblance of structure and law and order. Hearing stuff like that will make you really thankful really quick.
Yeah, just to that point, and I don't mean to again go off on a tangent, but in the Roman Empire, the city of Rome, around the time of the eruption of Pompeii, in Rome, only 1 in 3 people was not a slave. Imagine that. 2 out of every 3 people is a slave. I mean, history is just full of violence and oppression, and we're living in a very, very gilded golden age of human rights and freedom. And who knows if we'll get it right or if we'll revert to that, that barbarity. The Romans had a slave revolt to deal with in 79 AD, led by a gladiator who carried on that slave insurrection for 2 years. And when the Romans finally put them down, they crucified 10,000 slaves along the Appian Way. So, I mean, we're living in what arguably is a very, very small window of civility in the long course of human history. I just wanted to make that point to your own remark.
I agree. Do you think that it's realistic for us to expect that we will be able to hold on to this forever? And I don't mean this to be like doomsday-ish. Certainly, I am very quick to acknowledge that we've got something very good going on here, and I get frustrated with people that can't accept that. We've got problems, but generally very good. And like I was saying, a outlier in a lot of ways when it comes to world history, or at least world history that we know. Do you think that that's not long for this world on a long enough horizon?
The odds are against it, I think. The one thing we have going for us is, as I alluded earlier, the fact that our path to eternity, at least on this earth, is through having kids and successive generations. And so we have that one incentive to leave the world a little better place for them. And so maybe that tends to govern some of our worst instincts and our baddest behavior. But there are psychopaths out there who maybe don't feel those compunctions.
What gets you out of the Navy and pursuing a career in finance? I'd love to kind of talk about this next stage of your life and kind of how that sets you up into where you're at today. But you kind of lived through and worked through another turbulent time in the world back on the home front here that I'd love to get into.
Oh, yeah. Well, so I was at a bit of a crossroads, having spent that time working. The admiral who runs South America is based in Puerto Rico. And I found myself living on a sailboat, kind of enjoying the life of Riley at this point in my career, spending a lot of time in South America and doing some fairly rarefied things. And I I reflected on my objective, my career objective, which was until that point to be in the Foreign Service. And I think, you know, I think good fortune can be a double-edged sword. I, at the time, on a bit of a, not a bit of a lark, but on a bit of a kind of a belt and suspenders approach, I applied to graduate school. And it was at that point that I was fortunate to receive a scholarship to go to a business school. Went to NYU. And I almost felt like I couldn't turn it down. Business school scholarships don't come too often. This was a great opportunity. NYU had a great international business program. And I thought maybe instead of the Foreign Service, which felt to me a bit ineffectual, maybe business was the way to get back to South America again. And so I decided to go to NYU, and I resigned my commission, or the equivalent of resigning one's commission, and went off to business school in New York City. And that was really my departure from the service. You know, the old saw is that you either leave the Navy as an admiral or as a lieutenant in 04, but in between, it can be a rather difficult challenge. You're not senior enough to have a pension in the Navy, and you're not, but you're a little bit too old to kind of start a new career in the sense that most of us thought of a career back then. So I made the decision to take the opportunity and leap out of the Navy. I often look back on that and say, what the hell did I do that? But it was probably the right decision. So I went to business school, but it was at business school that I encountered finance. And I really enjoyed finance. I was struck by how much I enjoyed finance. And one of the things when you learn about finance that you're exposed to is investment banking. And there was this frenzy of people trying to get investment banking jobs at NYU that I was exposed to. And I felt like there was a whirling fan, and I was curious to know what it was, and I was going to touch my finger to it. And so I stepped into the blades and got kind of caught up in it. And next thing you know, I'm in it, and that's where I want to be. And all the other interests kind of got pushed aside, and it might have been a competitor in me. It might have been, I don't know what it was. It might have been kind of caught up in the euphoria of a crowd of smart, ambitious young people seeking their fortune. But that's the track that I got onto, and that's what I pursued.
Is there anything about that time that maybe spurred the focus or drive of all of these people to investment banking, or was it just a matter of circumstance? And certainly one thing that I have noticed about hanging around in different circles is I grew up in a group of people highly unmotivated, and I thought that was kind of it. And then you start to expand that circle, and you start looking at more advanced schools and higher performing people, and you see that there's always something more that you can be doing. And there are people out there being more aggressive about their career than you ever thought you could be.
Yes, for sure. There are people that I've encountered in my career that made me feel as though I was standing still. One of your other guests, Wes Gray, is one of those kind of people, right? Standing still and not really doing much with your life when you consider their trajectory. One of those people in my experience at NYU was a friend, prior Army officer named John Nelson. And John said, dude, you got to wake up. And I was fat, dumb, and happy, kind of, I'm going to go back to South America and figure out how to get back down there and do my thing. And John's like, oh, think of the opportunity, though, that you're able to pursue here. And when I spent time with John, I always got the feeling that I was 2 years or 3 years behind the curve. John was always on top of things. And it was, getting on in the school year, in the spring of, maybe it was even that first semester in the autumn of that first, it was this fall of that first year. And he said, look, if you want to do investment banking, or you want to have a shot at it, you got to get your shit together and apply yourself, because this process moves fast. And as Ferris Bueller says, you might miss it, because life moves fast on that career path. And so following John's advice, I got into this process and tried to get on the list to interview people at different firms. And I feel a little bit like a babe in the woods telling the story, but I remember getting on the Lehman Brothers interview roster that fall, and these two people from Lehman Brothers came and sat down with me to interview me. And they were clearly very unimpressed. They were not sure how I had gotten into the room with them, but they kind of peppered me from both sides with questions, and I had no idea how to answer those questions. Like I had not properly understood what I was preparing for when I prepared for that interview. And it was apparent to me that they didn't even have to say, well, nice chatting with you. I knew I would never see them again. And it was probably that experience that spurred me on to figure this thing out and get with the program. And, gradually each successive interview that you had to scratch and claw for became a better experience as I kind of got my feet. That was the process by which I woke up. And there were a few people like John Nelson around me who helped me to understand that. So we're fortunate, as you suggested, that if we can surround ourselves with good people, we might just keep our head above water and figure things out in time. In my case, that's a whole career pattern, barely figuring things out in time, not to get culled and tossed into the rubble heap.
Do you think that looking back again we're talking a lot of hindsight in this conversation, but
yeah,
with the benefit of that, how different do you think your outcome really would have been had John maybe not intervened in your life in a way that was certainly positive and kind of bucked you up a little bit?
Well, yeah. As I think I alluded earlier, one would think getting a scholarship to graduate school is a good thing, but it derailed me though from that very interesting trajectory that I was on toward the Foreign Service. Right, that ambassador in Bolivia said, "Hey, the military is a great stepping stone for the Foreign Service." And as I was really doing well in that career as an aide for this admiral and as a translator, I was getting all kinds of feedback from the embassies that we were working with that this was a great path for me and that I should pursue it. I was getting wonderful feedback about the work I was doing to enable the admiral to be more effective at his job. And I was having career conversations with the attachés and the embassy staff in each of these countries, trying to figure out how to do this. So that scholarship kind of took me off that track. And it derailed that interesting dream of pursuing that Foreign Service career. And I kept getting knocked farther and farther away from that track. John was an important element of that. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I could have very easily have said, I'm not interested. I'm doing something now, but maybe that's not how my mind or my DNA works. And so I pursued this other thing because people said it was good. And if I just figured it out in time, I might realize that it's a good thing to pursue. And that's kind of how I viewed it. I was able ultimately to go back and work in South America as an investment banker, but that turned out not to be a great path for a whole host of reasons. I won't bore you with them now, but I got pulled off that track. I think things definitely would have been different had I not, kind of fallen into that good luck pothole that I encountered.
So do you regret it?
Is
this the path that you should have taken, I guess?
Look, so many things would be different in my life. I might not have met my wife. I might not have had this very interesting and enjoyable career that I now enjoy and that I now love. It was definitely a hard road to take. And there have been a lot of times that I've regretted it. I've regretted it most because my natural abilities didn't mesh with 50% of the work of being an investment banker. The work of being an investment banker is about almost like being a private in the military, like you are on somebody else's schedule and you're working and filling your days with really hard, painful work, occasionally enjoying things that one is good at, the interpersonal side. But, I had to train my brain to be numerate, and that was a lot of work. And I wasn't innumerate, but I wasn't so naturally inclined. I've got a brain that is probably, as you might imagine, pretty verbal, given my language interests and skills. So I had to fit into a certain mold that for the first couple of years, when you're in the trenches doing financial analysis for other people, was really challenging. Now, ultimately, I was able to pull out of that trough and become more of a transaction originator in the banking world, where those other skills then came into being. Yeah. So when you can follow your calling, and that calling involves, almost by definition, your natural talents, you are always going to be happier. So that's, I think, an important lesson. Don't ignore your natural skills. Or you'll suffer. And that was time and again shared during those interviews. Time and again, people said, this is not a job to follow or to pursue because of the glamour, because you will be absolutely miserable. What does misery mean? It means sitting at a desk chair at 3 a.m. with your ass getting hot in the seat while you're trying to make a financial model balance sheet balance. It means doing comps. All these things happen between midnight and 5 a.m, doing comparables analyses late into the night so that someone can get on an airplane, at least when you're junior. Pretty soon it'll be you getting on the airplane, so that someone can get on an airplane and use the analysis in a conversation with the prospective client. Those are the kinds, and the analysis has to be right. So those are the kinds of challenges that junior investment bankers face. And if you are not gung-ho and facile with these tasks, it will be onerous, painful for you.
It's so funny you mention and kind of like draw some correlations between like investment banking and the military. I find it so funny that they both are very non-glamorous jobs, and what they're offering you in exchange for the outcome is so like it doesn't even look equitable, like especially in the early years. Maybe not, I can't really speak to the officer side of the military, but it's like, hey, come join the service and we're literally going to just work you to the bone. Like that's what we're here to do. We're here to make your life miserable and uncomfortable. But I don't know about the military necessarily, but the world of finance, they're beating people away. Yeah, come work 60, 70 hours a week and they just can't get enough of it. Like
it's insane.
Love it.
It's insane. The military, where I got beaten up pretty badly, as we all do, the military is where I learned to endure the pain that I ultimately faced as an investment banker. I mean, there's a lot to be said for being thick-skinned and being able to be yelled at in stressful situations, because the military carries its own interesting stresses, right? There's the stress of high op tempo, being in dangerous situations, risking your life at an activity, whether it's someone shooting at you. And I never had your experience of being shot at. I always worked during peacetime, even though I worked during the first Gulf War. I was always in situations where I was never in harm's way. But I did have enough risk in my life that I understood the stress of getting an aircraft safely back on deck. That stress is different and perhaps less corrosive than the stress in finance of working with other people's money on their timetable according to the market schedule. That's a different stress. And I think that's a harder stress, funny enough, risking other people's wealth. So they both have their own stresses, but one is very good preparation, which I think is why there's a lot of military in finance.
You worked through a couple of very difficult times in the world of finance. You started at Bear Stearns, I believe, in 96 through 2008, both the dot-com bust and the kind of mid GFC or so. What were, I guess, let's on our theme of hindsight here, what were your big takeaways from that time as an employee? Talk about maybe risk mitigation and how you maybe have seen the world of finance evolve since that time.
Oh, God, that's a big question. You might have to remind me of what you just asked me again if I go off on a tangent.
I couldn't even repeat it already. So,
well, so you're right. There were two big events while at Bear Stearns that rocked the global economy. The first one. So when I got to Bear Stearns, we were in kind of a golden age. We pulled out of the high interest rate environment of the early 80s. And for the last 12 or 15 years, the economy was in this kind of wonderful rolling, gaining momentum, not yet totally leveraged world where finance was growing, and it was growing, really quickly. And so I found myself the beneficiary of that, albeit a little bit late to the table. My friends from college were all kind of running Wall Street when I got there. But in my case, I got there and it was kind of a really nice period while we still had financial upsets like long-term capital management and the Asian currency crisis, the Russian currency default in the late 90s, 1998. We still had a relatively smooth ride in finance. That started to change in the late 2000s with the advent of the dot-com bubble. And that was a really tricky time. And for me, it was very interesting. Talk about risk management. I was privileged at the time to be to have a turn as a secretary on a committee called the Commitment Committee at Bear Stearns. The Commitment Committee was responsible for determining which transactions to get behind as an investment bank and to pursue. And they were largely all about financing transactions. And I think that name of that committee stemmed from the days when we were a partnership and we were committing the firm's capital and reputation to these transactions. Of course, most of these firms went public during this period of time. And so they were then working with other people's money, OPM. That's a very dangerous concept, by the way, but OPM enabled these firms to grow rather aggressively, take perhaps more risk. And it was in those committee meetings when the old guys who ran the firm and had run the firm for many years were trying to wrap their arms around what the hell these dot-com companies were doing and how they were doing it and what their prospects were. And it was fascinating. They would bring the deal team in and present the case for the transaction that was being considered. And then they would bring the analyst, the research analyst in and hear from him or her. And it was fascinating to see these old guys. I say old guys, I'm probably one of these old guys now, but at the time I was, 30 or 32, to see these old guys scratching their head, trying to figure out how these business models were going to work, right? There was no money involved at the time, except what was raised from investors. The only thing that we were valuing these companies based on was esoteric, ethereal concepts like eyeballs and clicks and pay, so when you tried to make a rational decision about a business's value and an IPO value in a time when there was historically no basis for doing so, these teams were stymied. Now, I don't think it prevented them from getting in the way of their own paychecks. And so they ultimately determined that this was business that we wanted to pursue. And so time and again, those conversations got a bit easier. But we were a leader in the early dot-com stage financing, IPO financing, with that first dot-com bubble, dot-com 1.0. And so it was a fascinating experience. And of course, all of that stuff came to grief, right? All of those companies, with almost very few exceptions, are no longer, on this side of the grass. And I just think that that experience for me was really eye-opening. So you ask about risk management. On the one hand, an investment bank can cover its risks by, highlighting risks to investors, but the wheels of capitalism turn and someone is going to finance these businesses. And so that became, a systemic process as other firms got into the business and started getting behind those early dot-com names and taking them public. It was a very fascinating time. I spent most of my career focused on M&A and the chemicals investment banking space. We did a lot of financings for the M&A clients we served, but it was largely around M&A, both for financial sponsors taking these companies over through private equity investments or through strategic combinations. So as my career advanced, I got away from that fly on the wall experience of seeing these old guys talk about how to understand this new economy. But that was a really interesting and eye-opening experience. I managed to avoid losing my job in that experience because it was a very tough time. The recession that ensued in the early 2000s was long and painful. By that time, I had gone to London, where I was starting up an investment banking team focused on chemicals in the European corporate space. So I got removed from that. But during that early period, I was reporting to David Solomon, in fact, who was chairman of the Commitment Committee. and managed the investment bank for Bear Stearns at the time with two other gentlemen. Really interesting times.
I loosely follow the world of finance and kind of what's happening there at a high level. I have been completely overwhelmed by it after an undergrad in finance and determined that that's maybe not the direction I wanted to go, but still follow along because I think it's interesting and fun. A lot of extrapolation about the more recent years and run up in valuations of these tech companies to the .com. And as somebody who can only like look back in time and try to make some comparisons, I find it's probably not quite as accurate as maybe somebody who had actually gone through that. Did you find yourself making comparisons over the last couple of years to that time?
Well, that old expression that history rhymes is kind of true, right? We're always improving on the old in many respects, but encountering new things. I mean, I didn't even begin to answer the question about the great financial crisis that you asked. I didn't begin to answer the question really about risk management. But as I go through these cycles, and I think it's an incredibly valuable experience to get a little gray hair in this business and go through these business cycles, one starts to tease out the commonalities. And I think those commonalities are that humans don't change, and human emotions and their ability to be swayed don't change. What changes really are the superficial circumstances. And so, yeah, there are a lot of similarities, but the similarities aren't in the finance itself. The similarities are in the behavioral aspects of humans who are undertaking the finance. And that once you come to that conclusion, and I'm not saying anything new here. I mean, our firm is built around getting the upper hand on behavioral biases, and you could listen to Wes or Cliff Asness or any of the smart quants out there who talk about this stuff. That's the thing that we have to step back and recognize as the constant in this world. And so, when I see new and just to pick up on what you said, like if you're not sure what I'm talking about is the fact that human beings are driven, in finance at least, predominantly by greed to make money and a fear of losing money. And those tendencies, together with some important behavioral biases like loss aversion, that's huge, and anchoring and extrapolation, those kinds of tendencies tend to recreate market patterns that are predictable. Timing is hard to predict, so don't interpret what I'm saying to suggest we can time these things. But by and large, you can observe patterns from cycle to cycle. They might be grouped around circumstances that are different, but those patterns are very much part of our human DNA, and they repeat and become predictable. And that's, I think, the fascinating thing about finance. And that's why our firm's mission to educate investors is so important, because the real thing that enables investors to make the right decisions for themselves is to learn about these pitfalls, to learn about these behavioral biases. And if you can educate students, practitioners, clients especially, about these pitfalls that our own monkey brains lead us into, they can become better at what they do. So yeah, I saw a lot of things from the .com era repeated in this recent period. I mean, meme stocks are such a fascinating and hard to wrap your head around phenomenon right now. But when you step back and look at it through the lens of behavioral biases, I think it's an entirely understandable process. That's the key message, I think, that emerges after a career in finance, that it's the human beings that create the patterns that are recognizable, really.
Wes was the first person in the quantitative space that I've ever talked to, and I've done a good amount of reading about it, but I was surprised at how different he pitched quantitative investing to me as opposed to what I thought it was. I kind of am going in approaching I have very systematic rules-based investing, and I really kind of was drawn, and I like that. But he pitched it as more of what you said. It is that, but the reason that we do that is because it's behavioral driven, and we're here to take advantage of that in a systematic way.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting application of it. And I don't think that that's like at the forefront of, hey, this is why we do it this way.
It's true that once you understand these patterns, you can be systematic. You can show courage where other people, typically from behavioral biases, show fear. You can show insight and use evidence-based strategies to overcome some of these interesting phenomena in behavioral finance. So it was eye-opening to me. I mean, when I encountered Wes, I was not familiar with quant finance. Warren Buffett was my conception of what an investor was, someone who was shrewd, and these guys at Bear Stearns that I watched kind of picking over the details of corporate balance sheets and individually understanding each situation. Wes opened my eyes to a more systematic approach that capitalizes on these shared attributes called factors, which define certain types of companies, particularly around notions of valuation and fundamentals, and harnessing that to capitalize on the law of large numbers to make money. Whereas Warren Buffett, he crawls over a business like buying a classic car, right? He wants to understand every aspect of it and see if he can't exert influence to create an opportunity for himself and his shareholders to invest. Quant finance is very different. And I was fascinated by that understanding, building that understanding of what we do at our firm. Great education. And once you embrace quantitative finance, you can almost forget about all the bullshit, like what's the Fed going to do? Does it matter? It matters because regimes change, and you need to be kind of understanding how those regimes change, specifically if you're trend following and not looking specifically at price trends. But for us to be able to not really care about what's going on day to day in the markets because the system is based upon these overarching truths that we believe define behavioral bias. That's a really liberating experience. Anyway, it's probably where I remember being struck as I was learning about what the firm does, and when I came on board early in the mid-20s, 2015, 2016 timeframe, learning about us.
How exactly did you end up meeting Wes and coming to work at Alpha Architect?
Oh, so Wes and I, we share a couple of overlaps. We both attended Penn, and obviously we're veterans together with an interest in finance. And so a mutual acquaintance of ours in the Philadelphia veteran network that we're involved in here, we're kind of a big informal group of people who know each other, said, "Hey, Doug, you should meet Wes. You'd like him." And so he connected us, and I reached out and said, "Hey, Wes, let's get together and see what comes of it." So in the first instance, actually a funny story. In the first instance, at the time, he was a professor at Drexel University, teaching business there while he was, building our business on the side. And so he invited me to his office to hang out and get acquainted. So I showed up there one day, and he was in one of these old buildings that was probably built 100 years ago and had been chopped up. And so he had this bizarre office that was like 4 feet wide and 20 feet long. So his office consisted of a long desk and a long bookshelf, right, with one of those kind of doors that fold over. And so we're sitting in this kind of awkward space, chatting, swapping stories about military and our experiences in the military. And he shared with me that he'd served in Iraq as an intel officer. And at one point he said, "Oh, you might be interested in my book that I wrote." And I was really impressed. "Wes, you wrote a book?" I said, yeah. I was embedded with the Iraqi forces in Al-Anbar province, and took a lot of notes and wrote a book about it when I got out. And he lifts this cabinet door, like one of these doors that kind of folds up and slides in. And there's this incredible, 4 feet of shelf space with his book, with the spine of his, 50 copies of this book that he just published. I think it was Naval Press. And gave me a copy, signed it, Semper Fi Wes. It was really very, very interesting for me. And I swore that I was going to go home and read it and get back to him. And I was grateful and impressed. But we're still hanging out, talking and chatting. And, half an hour later, we're talking about finance. And he looks at me kind of like the same way he did earlier in the conversation when he showed me that book. And he said, "Oh, you might be interested in my other book." And at this stage, I'm like, "You've got another book?" And he lifts up the shelf above my head, and there's this, 4 feet of these of these neatly bound brand new books on the shelf, quantitative finance. Sorry, I don't have a copy to hand, or I'd show it to you. But it was a book describing his journey to understanding value investing and understanding finance. And so again, I walk out with these two books and I think to myself, here's a guy who's different, clearly different, and I want to understand this gentleman better. And who knows, what could come of it. So that was probably in 2012, 2013, and 2013 maybe. And a little later on, I reciprocated and had him over to my offices. And I'm not going to name the firm where I was for reasons that'll become obvious, but we're sitting around in this big open space chatting. I was at a family office at the time, kind of between gigs, trying to figure out what was next. And Wes shows up, in shorts and a t-shirt and a baseball cap backwards and a backpack. And, everyone's kind of sitting around in business casual. And so I have Wes over and we sit down in this big open space in the midst of the floor of my, this team that I was working with. And we're part of a much larger firm whose, primary business in this particular floor space was asset allocation. Like that's where they were focusing their energies. And so Wes looks at me and goes, what the hell are all these people doing? Wes, he likes a little bit of profanity to spice up his language, which I appreciate. Wes looks at me and goes like, what the hell are all these people doing here? I said, well, we are focused on asset allocation. And I started going down the path of citing studies, 90% of financial returns and investments really are based on asset allocation. We're not so much on stock picking. We farm that out for other people. And Wes is kind of like got this grin on his face and he's shaking his head. And I'm like, what? He goes, it's all bullshit. It's just activity, right? Activity for the sake of appearing to be working. And he said, you could fire all these people and just use a very simple model of asset allocation that would do as well as everybody else here, if not better. And I'm like, Wes, kind of keep it down here. Everybody here is drinking the Kool-Aid. Yeah, so I was really keen to understand what he meant by that. And, I kind of think of that as the start of a beautiful friendship. We got to know each other and wound up trying to do a lot together because we embraced Wes's view of behavioral biases. That was one overlap that we did have in common with the firm that I worked for. So we got to know each other at that period of time. And, Wes asked me, hey, are you going to hang out in this place the rest of your life and be an entrepreneur, or do you want to come and join me and be an entrepreneur? And at the time, I was trying to repair my balance sheet from great financial crisis. So I was a little less averse to starting over again. At the time, that would have meant working in Wes's basement, basically, which I ultimately opted to do. But at the time, I politely suggested that I'd have to think about that. We dated a long time before we could figure out how to work together. And, and he has since won me over to those early viewpoints about wasted space and wasted time. But that was our earliest encounter.
In our conversation, we got to talking a lot about like system 1 and system 2 thinking. And he was kind of getting me schooled up on a lot of stuff. And I could see how he would be persuasive.
Yeah, he's very persuasive. Like there's a good reason he's a business school professor, because he has a gift, a rare gift, I think, which is the ability to distill very complicated concepts into simple to understand terms. And I love that about him. Like when we hang out together, he's able to educate my kids. My kids love him. The guy is like, he's a wonderful explainer. My kids don't want to hear from me. They want to hear from Dr. Wesley Gray.
Right.
Or Dr. Katie Gray, is the case may be. Sorry.
No, you're good. You have come to take over their business of head of 1042 solutions. I had to do some reading and a lot of listening to kind of understand what this is. But I'd love to kind of hear about what you do for Alpha Architect now, and why it's important, I guess. Well, why should the listeners care?
It wasn't a business at the time that I joined. I joined to make this a business. So when I was still at that old firm, we had a client, Alpha Architect had a client at the time who happened to be one of the firm's business partners, a guy named David. David's no longer with the firm. He went on to do bigger and better things. But at the time, David's family was going to sell stock in the family business that they owned, which happened to be an ESOP company, a large ESOP company, a $10 billion Philadelphia-based ESOP company. People in the industry will probably know who it is, so I'm not going to say who overtly. But at the time, Wes had, together with the team, had worked to understand what the opportunity was associated with this interesting thing called an ESOP, employee stock ownership plan. And he had created an interesting strategy that worked for this family, but it wasn't suitable in its form then really for the market, which required some tweaks to it. So at the time, I was trying to convince the firm that I was at to let me build a business using what I saw as the virtues in this strategy at the firm that I was at. And they not only said no, they said, hell no, go back to your hole. And so I went to Alpha Architect and said, Wes, let's build this business. I have a vision for this business, and let me build this. And that entailed creating a number of innovations. But what we've created is completely new in the employee stock ownership plan space. And I believe what it does is it liberates business owners from the perhaps not so appropriate, not so investor-friendly approaches to this investment niche that existed for eons now in the past. What we've built is really something new. And I think what it does is it creates a more attractive lens for business owners who are evaluating whether to sell their companies to their employees, which I think is, it's a good thing. I get up in the morning thinking that I sleep well at night, and I like what I do, and it's good for the communities that I work with.
Back in your interview in 2021 with MEB, you had mentioned that there were around 7,000 companies that had ESOPs. I'm not going to hold you to that number nor ask what it is today, but that's just to kind of give maybe some perspective about what it is. Can you maybe explain for the layman here why a company would have an ESOP, and then what gets them in the position of like needing what you guys offer?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question, because I think most people's eyes glaze over when they hear the words of employee stock ownership and employee stock ownership plans. So I don't know if there are 7,000 companies. Whenever we come through these periods of cheap money and high M&A activity, you don't know how many new ESOPs get formed versus how many other ones get acquired. But okay, so there's thousands out there. And every year now we've seen a growing popularity in the last couple of years in this space. So an employee stock ownership plan is a fancy word for a way for business owners to sell their companies essentially to their employees, without their employees having to put a dime of their own money into that transaction. I call it a transaction because that's what it is. So a business owner, and this might be a business owner who's tried to sell his company in the past to other buyers and failed. It might be a business owner who really, ideally, feels beholden to his employees and wants this to be a way for him to pass on what they've built with him to them, as a way of saying, in part, thanks, and in part, let's do something that's good for your families and our community that'll give me a sense of legacy. So what it is a qualified plan, a qualified retirement plan, like a 401k. I'm just describing a structure, right? It's a legal structure, it's an entity, but that entity is formed by the business owner who says to himself in his reasoning, I can sell my company to my competitor, and that son of a bitch is going to climb around my company, learn all my trade secrets, and then when he buys my company, fire all my employees. I mean, that's like the downside of M&A. Or I can sell my company to my employees and walk away with an attractive payout that is competitive, I would say more competitive or advantageous than a third-party sale. And I can do so in a way that metamorphosizes or transforms the ownership of this company from myself to my employees without any of those negative side effects. In fact, with many positive benefits. And so what do I mean? Well, when a business owner sells his company to his employees through an employee stock ownership plan, what he's doing is hiring a team of advisors, including a trustee. That trustee is going to be placed in charge of a trust that the business owner forms for the purpose of buying his stock from him or her in the business. So the business owner is hiring a counterparty to negotiate with him a price, a valuation for the stock that he is going or she is going to sell to essentially this trust. This trust is a retirement plan created within the framework of ERISA to own these shares. And in summary, the benefits to the community are such that Congress wants these types of transactions to happen, wants it enough that with bipartisan support consistently over the decades, they're willing to convey certain benefits to both the business owner for doing this transaction and the company itself after the transaction to make them attractive. What are those benefits? Well, they're predominantly tax benefits, but what they create is an entity then that is employee owned. And employee ownership is an incredibly powerful force of nature. This is not to say communism, right? This is not to say socialism. This is to say that we are creating capitalists in each employee. And an employee who owns a piece of her business or his business takes his work home with him, right? Takes his problems home with her. And that way of thinking, we call it an ownership culture, that makes them better employees. And that makes that business more competitive, more productive, and better able to withstand the vicissitudes of the business cycle. It's a very powerful culture, and it's created by this process, through this process that Congress has mandated is good for society. And so business owners benefit in some instances by not having to pay capital gains taxes or deferring them if they choose not to defer them permanently. Companies benefit who do this because the entity itself can become a tax-free entity. What do I mean by that? Well, if a business is sold by its owner to a qualified retirement plan that owns the stock, well, we all know that qualified retirement plans are essentially tax-free entities. So if the shares are owned and this business is held in the form of an S corporation, then profits pass to the shareholder essentially tax-free. So you can appreciate how much more competitive a business can be if all of the cash that would have been paid away or taxed away by authorities as a C Corp instead flow to the qualified retirement plan that owns it on behalf of the employees. I hope I haven't abused the trust of your listeners by going down that wormhole, but I think it's important to share that this is a really attractive structure for a business to operate under.
No, this is good, and this is really interesting, like all stuff that I didn't know and I'm like interested to learn more about. So this is basically is the owner not paying tax when they sell the business to this kind of middle trustee entity, and then it's then passed to the employees from there?
Yes. So the business owner can elect to sell his or her stock in two ways. One is as an S corporation. And if the company that is being sold is an S corporation, the business owner does have to pay taxes. The company immediately, though, as a tax-free entity, does not have to pay taxes on any profits that pass to the ESOP plan for the shares that are owned. So that's one attractive way. But I think business owners have come around to the fact that they can have their cake and eat it too if they sell as a C corporation. If a business owner who owns a C corporation sells his or her stock to an ESOP, that business owner doesn't have to pay capital gains taxes on the sale proceeds, provided that the business owner complies with the statutes as to the reinvestment of those proceeds in something called qualified replacement property. So that business owner can defer taxes indefinitely, potentially permanently, and the entity that buys, the trust that buys those shares, that entity can then convert the company to an S corp and be a tax-free entity, as I described before. It's the most remarkable and like I was an investment banker right? Doing M&A, we never talked about an ESOP. Now, for good reasons, probably because we were dealing with companies that were, large or mega caps. But you couldn't earn a fee being an ESOP advisor in my business. You get fired if you talk to someone about an ESOP. Whereas in this small private company, and I mean small, like 5 million in value to 500 million in value, it's really a very inexpensive, more so than M&A, and I think most efficient. It is the most efficient transaction structure I've ever seen, and it's wonderful. It's a win-win.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of multiple wins there. Like you said, you've got the owner of the business is able to kind of cash out in a way that's advantage to them. They are able to there's a certain element of wanting to, maybe as you get older, you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket if your entire fate of your retirement is resting on just the company that you've bootstrapped or whatever. Mm-hmm. So you de-risk that event. You also, the ownership culture, like you said, that literally sounds fantastic.
Oh, it's huge. And when you think about what you have to go through as an owner to sell a business to a third party, especially if the third party is a financial sponsor. Look, I worked for financial sponsors for a long time. Bain was a big client. They are a rapacious group of buyers, and you kind of take your life in your hands negotiating with them. Not to impugn any particular organization, but as a group, they're a very very self-interested organization on behalf of their investors. If you can avoid that process and consider an ESOP is a ready and willing buyer, and you create the ESOP, right? You appoint your counterparty to negotiate with you the sale of your transaction. Now, he's a fiduciary and he's going to represent the interests of the employees in the plan, but it's nothing like the convulsive process one goes through in an M&A transaction. It really is an enlightened way to sell a business.
So then where do you guys come in? What is it that you guys offer as a service to kind of help with this, facilitate this transaction?
Right. Well, so in order to defer capital gains taxes in a transaction such as this, a business owner must roll the proceeds from the sale into a certain type of investment called qualified replacement property. Now, this is tricky because it requires selecting securities for which there is imperfect information to form the basis of that selection. For that reason, none of the investment banks wants really to have any part of being on the hook for that selection process. So historically, what they've done is they've gotten a couple of their best clients to issue bonds that the clients represent meet the needs under the statutes of this qualified replacement property. So they've pushed that risk off onto corporate clients. Corporate clients are like, yeah, I'm getting a good deal. I'm going to sell a bond to some guy for a below market rate in order to give them this qualified replacement property. The problem with that strategy is that these are unattractive bonds that business owners typically wouldn't buy unless they're significantly older or perhaps infirm. They probably wouldn't buy these based on their investment attributes. These are bonds that have one virtue, and that is that you can borrow against them, hopefully, typically. And so buying these bonds gives you the ability to, in our view, perhaps enrich the lenders who will lend you money against those bonds. The sad part about that, though, is you buy these bonds and then hand them over to the investment bank that essentially sold them to you for the privilege of taking a loan out against those bonds so you can get access to your or a portion of your proceeds. The loan costs more than the bonds yield, so you're always paying out of pocket just to have access to your money. And that might happen for the rest of your life if you're going to defer your taxes permanently. That felt like a difficult situation for our business partner and his family, and we certainly understand that. So what we've created required us to go out on a limb and actually make the security selection for clients. And that would never have happened if we hadn't one of our own business partners in the position of needing this, right? That it involved 1,000 man hours to go through the process of scrubbing the securities to qualify these securities. And thank goodness the firm has a technological orientation. Like, we are, by and large, a firm of coders. And so we were able to automate what was a manually intensive balls ache of a process for our clients now. And that gave us the ability to do this for other clients. So what we're doing now is we're selecting securities in the S&P 500 that qualify for this qualified replacement property treatment and fashioning an index for them to invest that replicates or seeks to replicate, I should say, the risk and return attributes of the S&P 500.
If you were to kind of take this situation and zoom out, and could you draw me a comparison of like what, like maybe we'll play out an example if we can, or something like that to compare, like, hey, is it pure cost savings? This is what it's going to cost you to do this, and this is what it's going to cost with you guys, to kind of like highlight that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to be careful here about talking about costs because I'm talking about somebody else's investment product, right? That product is sold with a prospectus. It's sold by people who are typically not fiduciaries in that moment when they're selling that product. And so there are costs associated with that that are multi-layered. The first obvious cost is that if I'm buying a bond, the bond's got to yield something, and is what it yields competitive or market with what I could be earning on a long-term bond that I'm buying. The funny thing about qualified replacement property is the moment a business owner sells it, he's got to pay capital, or she got to pay capital gains taxes that would have been due at the time that the business owner sold their business, right? That's the nature of the tax deferral. I am rolling my proceeds, that's why it's called a rollover investment. I'm rolling my proceeds from the sale of my stock into an asset that is supposed to have parallel attributes to the stock that I just sold to the employee stock ownership plan, and hold that asset. And the moment I sell that asset, well, by golly, I'm going to be paying capital gains taxes that would have been due at the time of sale, and any more that would have accrued during the appreciation of the asset that I now own. So that's a really complicated concept, but what we wanted to do was get out of the world of having to borrow against our own investments just to have access to our money from the sale, so that we could then invest in a more appropriate or a more attractive or a more aligned portfolio, diversified portfolio of assets. We wanted to get away from that thing that we viewed as beneficial to the investment bankers that sold it, and perhaps to a smaller subset of business owners who found those attributes attractive. We wanted to provide something that was more akin to an equity-oriented investment. So your question, though, about stepping back is important because this is complicated stuff, and I haven't done a very good job of demystifying it. I guess if I could say, what are the key attributes? Well, we think that our strategy is very sophisticated and creates a lot more flexibility for clients than the existing strategy does. And we think that that flexibility gives them a better shot at achieving their goals and making, compounding wealth for themselves. So over time, we think this is a pretty significant difference in outcomes potentially. And so I'm probably out over my ski tips by through a public forum talking about what it is we're doing here, but we just think that fundamentally it's a more investor-friendly oriented business.
No, it's a good to know. And I think that there are many people who run and operate businesses that listen to this show that probably and likely will be interested in at least hearing more, I should say. If somebody wanted to reach out to you to start up a conversation about this and how it may or may not work with their business and what Alpha Architect can do with them, where would you want to send people?
Well, you can get to us through our website, or just email me at doug@alphaarchitect.com. What we typically engage in is an educational process with business owners, because this is complex and Congress was rather inartful in constructing and drafting the legislation around employee stock ownership plans. So we've had to, unfortunately, create a solution that shares some of the complexity of the strategies that we think are inferior out there. But that said, a client is best able to make his or her own decisions when she understands all the facts and understands what is being proposed. And too often we think that process gets pushed back by other formation advisors. So if someone were to come to me, as happens, every day, every week, and say, educate me, we would go through a process of describing what the opportunity entails, this interesting legislation, and describing how the meaningful, or I should say predominant strategies in the marketplace, ours and floating rate note strategy, how they compare, and then hopefully pointing this person or people to some of the formation advisors, ESOP formation advisors that we're aware of out there who do this and do it well and sustainably. It's a very small universe, and it's very easy to be accused of making referrals with the expectation of getting referrals back. We try to look at those advisors who demonstrate independence in this space, because we think that's a murky area.
Gotcha. Yeah, this is a very like unique niche. And as I was talking with Wes a few weeks back, he was kind of highlighting some of how you don't really know exactly what the business is going to offer, but as you find unique use cases or like certain things come up, and then you say, oh, there's a business around this. There's something we can maybe do this at a larger scale. If one person is experiencing it, then there's likely more than that.
Yes, and we've built quite an interesting business. That process of building this business stems from writing articles about it, publishing, as we do with all of our ideas, publishing those ideas, and then hopefully in that process we get an inbound phone call from a few percentage points of the audience out there that come across this research, and that begins that dialogue. That's a really ideal way to build a client relationship, a client dialogue. Interest on both sides, mutual interest, no pressure. We don't sell what we do. We just expose clients to our thinking, and they have to opt in.
I'll be sure to include links to Alpha Architect and all the content you guys put out on the show notes. You guys put out a lot of really good stuff. I'm a very frequent reader of all of it.
You're kind. Thank you.
Doug, I really, really appreciate your time in this conversation today. If you were to sum up the one thing that we could take away and implement into our lives today, what would that be?
No, I think it stems from advice that I got early as an as a business school student from a mentor who said, whatever your situation, certainly professionally, but whatever that situation may be, always think like an owner. Because it's when you take the perspective of maybe the person who is employing you, or the view of the person whose equity is at stake in whatever that enterprise might be, you'll just make better decisions. And I have found that to be the differentiating factor. We're always trying to differentiate ourselves. I think the Air Force called it stratify ourselves. Think like an owner. And even if you're a cog in the wheel in the military, someone will take notice of the fact that you're making decisions not with a view toward getting through a task, but with a view toward making the organization better and more productive. I think that's the best advice I've ever gotten. And it interestingly enough has flowed through into my choice of the financial career that I've undertaken here with Wes and the team. That is that we're trying to promote people who think like owners and promote opportunities where people can think like owners. And that it's a very powerful force of nature. It's kind of like the power of compounding. It's tremendous. And people who think like an owner just make better decisions through life. I think that would be the one key takeaway over my career.
That's fantastic and absolutely great advice. I think that we could all implement that idea a little bit better. Doug, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Brock. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. Your listenership helps me better educate people like you and the rest of our nation's military, both past and present, on building a successful life outside of military service. If you're looking for more ways the top vets are leading more effective lifestyles, building businesses, and using the resources designed specifically for you, press here for a selection of some of the best clips. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date, and I will be talking with you soon.